Story 1. Right now, somewhere in Louisiana, a house is standing that has never let go of its dead. Welcome to Lunar Lore. I'm your host, Mubarak. And tonight, we're going somewhere that researchers, historians, and paranormal investigators have spent years trying to explain. A place where the evidence of something deeply wrong keeps piling up no matter how many times people try to dismiss it. The Myrtles Plantation in St. Francisville, Louisiana. A real house, a real history, and a darkness that has no clean explanation. Before we go any further, I want to be clear about something. This is not a story built on imagination alone. The details you're about to hear come from historical records, documented investigations, and first-hand accounts collected over more than 2 centuries. And what makes it truly terrifying is not the legend. It's the verified truth hiding underneath the legend. Because when researchers stripped away every exaggeration, every embellishment, every ghost tour dramatization, what remained was still deeply disturbing. One confirmed murder, dozens of unexplained events, and a property that seems to hold on to the people who died there, like it simply refuses to let them leave. Let's start from the very beginning. The year is 1796. The United States is barely 20 years old. Louisiana is still a wild, swampy, dangerous territory where fortunes are made and lives are lost with equal speed. A man named General David Bradford arrives and begins building a home on a piece of land just outside what would eventually become Stain, Francisville. Bradford is not a simple farmer. He is a man fleeing serious trouble. Back in Pennsylvania, he had been one of the key figures in what became known as the Whiskey Rebellion, an armed uprising against the federal government's tax on whiskey. When the rebellion was crushed, Bradford knew he was in danger of being prosecuted, possibly executed. So he ran. He came south. He came to Louisiana, and on a piece of quiet tree-lined land, he began building what would become the Myrtles Plantation. The house he built was impressive for its time. A long, elegant structure with wide-covered porches running the full length of the front, iron lacework decorating the railings, tall windows catching the breeze from the surrounding land. Bradford planted crepe myrtle trees around the property, beautiful flowering trees that gave the plantation its name. He built this place to last. He built it to be a monument to his survival, and in many ways, it has outlasted everything he ever imagined. But survival has a price, and the land Bradford chose to build on was not empty when he arrived. This is where the first shadow falls over the history of the Myrtles. Long before David Bradford ever set foot in Louisiana, the land beneath what would become the Myrtles Plantation was considered sacred ground by the Tunica people, a Native American tribe who had lived in that region for generations. There are accounts, collected over many years by historians and local researchers, that suggest Bradford's plantation was built directly on top of a Tunica burial ground. Now, it's important to be honest here. This claim has never been fully verified through archaeological excavation, but it has also never been definitively disproven. And when you look at the sheer volume of strange events that have been reported on this land for over 2 centuries, the idea that something was disturbed when Bradford broke that ground becomes harder and harder to simply dismiss. The Tunica people believed, as many Native American cultures do, that the dead deserve rest, that the ground they are buried in is not just dirt. It is a continuation of their existence, a sacred space where the spirit remains connected to the physical world. To build over that space, to dig into it, to plow it up and plant cotton, and build a mansion on top of it. In their understanding, that would not go unanswered. And in the 230 years since Bradford first broke that ground, it seems like something has been answering ever since. Bradford lived in the house until 1799, when he was pardoned for his role in the Whiskey Rebellion and was finally able to return to Pennsylvania without fear of prosecution. He sold the Myrtles, and the house passed through a series of hands over the following decades. Each family that moved in brought their own lives, their own stories, their own tragedies, and the property collected all of them. It held onto them the way deep water holds onto everything that sinks into it. Quietly, completely, with no intention of ever letting go. The next family of significance was the Clark family, who took ownership in the early 1800s. Rough and Gray Sterling purchased the property around 1834 and made significant renovations, expanding the house and adding the elaborate decorative plasterwork and marble mantels that still exist today. The Sterling family lived there through the Civil War years, which brought their own particular brand of horror to the property. Louisiana was a state divided, a land of violence and upheaval, and the Myrtles sat right in the middle of all of it. But it was after the Civil War, during the chaotic and dangerous years of Reconstruction, that the event occurred which has haunted this house more than anything else. The murder of William Drew Winter. William Winter was a lawyer. He had married into the Sterling family and eventually became the owner of the Myrtles. By all accounts, he was a respected man in the community, educated, composed, the kind of person who believed in order and law even in a region where order and law were constantly being tested. He and his wife Sarah lived in the house and raised their family there. By 1871, the Reconstruction era was making life in Louisiana increasingly tense and dangerous. The political situation was unstable, violence was common, and on the evening of January 26, 1871, someone came to the Myrtles looking for William Winter with something other than business on their mind. The details of what happened that night have been pieced together from historical records and investigative research, including the detailed work done by Troy Taylor and David Wishart, who spent considerable time and effort separating the verified facts of this case from the myths that grew around it. What they found, and what the historical record confirms, is this: a rider on horseback appeared at the Myrtles that January evening and called out from outside the house, asking for William Winter to come out. The reason for the summons was either unclear or deliberately misleading. Winter, apparently not alarmed, perhaps he knew the person, perhaps it seemed routine, came out onto the side porch of the house. He was shot at close range. The shooter fled on horseback into the darkness. The identity of the killer was never conclusively established, though suspicion in the community fell on certain individuals connected to the violent political tensions of the era. No one was ever formally charged, tried, or convicted for William Winter's murder. The case went cold in the way that many cases went cold in the lawless years after the Civil War. Not because the truth was hidden, but because the machinery of justice was too broken to pursue it. But here is where history ends and something else begins. Because William Winter did not die immediately on that porch. The bullet had struck him, but had not killed him outright. And what happened in the minutes that followed is the core of the most persistent legend attached to the Myrtles Plantation. According to the legend, and this is where Taylor and Wishart carefully note that the facts diverge from the story that has been told on ghost tours for decades. Winter staggered back into the house after being shot. He moved through the gentleman's parlor, through the lady's parlor, and made his way to the central staircase of the home. And then, with whatever strength remained in his dying body, he began to climb, step by step, up the staircase that rose from the central hallway. His wife Sarah was at the top of those stairs. He was trying to reach her. He was trying to die in her arms rather than on a cold porch alone. He made it to the 17th step. That is where William Winter collapsed and died, on the 17th step of the staircase of the Myrtles Plantation, with his wife rushing down toward him, reaching him just as his body gave out. He died there, on those stairs, in her arms, exactly 17 steps from the ground floor. Now, Taylor and Wishart note in their investigation that the specific details of how Winter moved through the house after being shot, which rooms he passed through, the exact step where he fell. These elements have been dramatized and embellished over the years to create a more compelling ghost tour narrative. The core fact is that he was shot, he was mortally wounded, and he died in the house. The 17 steps detail, while it has become the iconic image of Winter's death at the Myrtles, carries with it the weight of storytelling tradition layered on top of historical record. But even accounting for that, the fundamental truth remains: a man was murdered in that house, died on those stairs, and was never given justice. And something has apparently been replaying that death ever since. Because for as long as people have lived in or visited the Myrtles Plantation, they have reported hearing footsteps. Not random footsteps scattered through the house, specific footsteps. Footsteps that come in through the side entrance, move through the parlor rooms, approach the staircase, and then begin climbing, step by step, slowly, with the labored, uneven rhythm of someone who is hurt, someone who is barely moving, someone who is dying. And the footsteps always stop at the same place, the 17th step. People have heard this in the middle of the night. They have heard it in broad daylight. Guests who had no prior knowledge of William Winter's story, guests who came to the Myrtles simply as a hotel, simply to sleep in a historic house in the Louisiana countryside, have woken up at 2 in the morning to the sound of someone climbing those stairs, have gotten up to check, have found no one there, have stood at the top of the staircase looking down at an empty hallway, listening to the silence where footsteps had been just moments before. And then they find out about William Winter, and they understand what they heard. The staircase itself is still there, still in the same position it was in 1871. Guests at the Myrtles today can walk down it every morning on their way to breakfast. They can count the steps, They can stop on step 17 and stand there for a moment, in the exact spot where a man took his last breath 150 years ago, and feel whatever it is they feel in that moment. Some people feel nothing. Some people feel a chill that has nothing to do with the temperature. Some people report that something feels different on that step, heavier, somehow, than the steps above and below it, as if the wood itself remembers. But the footsteps are only one piece of what has been documented at the Myrtles. There is also the matter of the mirror. In the main house, hanging in what was once a primary living space, there is a large antique mirror. Mirrors, in many cultural traditions surrounding death and mourning, hold a particular significance. In the American South, in the 1800s, it was common practice to cover mirrors in a house where someone had recently died. The belief was that the soul of the deceased, still lingering near the body and near the home, might become trapped in the reflection, caught between the living world and whatever comes after. Whether you believe in that tradition or dismiss it as superstition, it was taken seriously by the people of that era. It was a meaningful ritual. At the Myrtles Plantation, the story goes that when William Winter was killed and his body was brought into the house, the mirrors were not covered in time, and something, some presence, some energy, became trapped in the glass. What researchers and staff and visitors have documented over the years is this: the mirror in the Myrtles shows handprints, small handprints, not the handprints of adults, the handprints of children. They appear on the surface of the glass, seemingly without explanation. Staff clean the mirror thoroughly. They wipe it down completely. They polish the glass until it is spotless. And then, hours later, or sometimes the next morning, the handprints are back, in the same positions, the same size, as if whoever left them is pressing their palms against the glass from the other side. The phenomenon was persistent enough and unexplained enough that at some point the decision was made to replace the mirror entirely. The old mirror was removed. A new mirror was installed in its place. Clean glass, new frame, no history attached to it whatsoever. The handprints came back on the new mirror, same size, same positions, same inexplicable appearance after cleaning. There is no satisfactory rational explanation for this that has been publicly documented. The mirrors have been examined. The glass has been tested. The room conditions have been considered. And yet the handprints continue to appear. Taylor and Wishart, who approached the Myrtles with the specific goal of separating verified fact from invented legend, did not attempt to explain away this phenomenon. What they said, carefully and honestly, is that the sheer number of accounts reporting similar experiences at the Myrtles is significant. Not because any single account proves something supernatural, but because when hundreds of independent witnesses, many of whom had no prior knowledge of the specific stories attached to the house, report the same things in the same locations over a period of more than a century, that accumulation of consistent testimony demands to be taken seriously. Think about what that means. A person checks into the Myrtles as a hotel guest. They know nothing about the mirror story. They have never heard of William Winter. They are there because it is a historic property with good reviews, and they wanted somewhere interesting to stay For the night, they go to sleep. In the morning, they walk past the mirror in the hallway, and they stop because there are small handprints on the glass that were not there the night before. They mention it to the staff. The staff nods slowly, because they have heard this before, because it happens regularly, because no matter how many times that mirror is cleaned, those handprints come back. Whose hands are pressing against that glass? That question has no answer, but it has been asked at the Myrtles for over 150 years. And whatever is on the other side of that mirror has never stopped pressing back. There are other things too. Other events that have been documented at the property over the decades and centuries. A French and mirrors are only the beginning of what has been catalogued. Guests have reported seeing a woman in period clothing, a long dress, dark fabric, moving through the rooms of the house in the early morning hours. She appears at the edge of vision, turns, and is gone before the witness can fully process what they are seeing. She has been reported by enough guests, in enough different years, that she has been given a name by the Myrtles mythology, Chloe. The story attached to Chloe is one of the most dramatic and emotionally complex narratives associated with the plantation, and it is also one where the historical record becomes murky in ways that deserve honest examination. The legend of Chloe goes like this. She was an enslaved woman who worked in the main house during the tenure of one of the plantation's owners. She was reportedly forced into a sexual relationship with the plantation owner, a circumstance of profound violation that was tragically common during the era of American slavery. When the relationship ended, when the owner turned his attentions elsewhere, Chloe allegedly became desperate with fear about what her fate would be. Enslaved people who fell out of favor with plantation owners could be sold, sent to work in the fields under brutal conditions, or subjected to punishment at the owner's discretion. Chloe, according to the legend, began eavesdropping on conversations in the household, listening at doors to try to find out what was being planned for her. She was caught doing this. As punishment, one of her ears was cut off. After that, she always wore a green turban to cover the wound. The legend continues desperate and fearful. Chloe allegedly baked a cake laced with oleander leaves, a plant that contains compounds toxic to humans, and served it to the family at a birthday party. The intent, according to the story, was to make them ill enough to need nursing, so that she could prove her value as a caretaker and secure her position in the household. But she misjudged the dose, or the children ate more than she intended, and 2 of the plantation owner's young daughters died. The other enslaved people on the plantation, fearing collective punishment for Chloe's actions, dragged her from the house. She was hanged. Her body was thrown into the Mississippi River. It is a story of tremendous suffering. A woman trapped at every turn by a system that gave her no rights, no protection, and no escape. Whether she acted in desperation or calculation, or something in between, the tragedy of her existence within that system is undeniable. But Taylor and Wishott's investigation raises serious questions about the historical accuracy of this narrative. There is no documented record of Chloe in the plantation's historical paperwork. there is no record of the deaths of 2 children from poisoning at the Myrtles during the relevant period. The tale appears to have grown over time, accumulating detail and drama with each retelling, in the way that legends do. What may have begun as a fragment of a real story, an enslaved woman, a violent punishment, a tragedy, became something much more elaborate as it passed from mouth to mouth over generations. What this means is complicated. It does not mean that nothing happened at the Myrtles involving enslaved people who suffered. The opposite is certainly true. Any plantation that operated in Louisiana in the 1800s was a site of profound human suffering. The people who were enslaved there lived lives of crushing hardship and constant vulnerability. Their deaths went largely unrecorded. Their stories were not preserved. The violence done to them was routine and normalized by the society around it. If any location should carry the weight of unquiet history, it is a plantation in the American South. But the specific legend of Chloe, as it has been told on ghost tours and in horror content for decades, appears to be significantly more fiction than fact. And yet, the woman in the green turban has been seen, not just reported once, not just described by one unreliable witness, but described consistently by multiple guests over many years. A woman in old, fashioned clothing wearing something green on her head, appearing briefly in the rooms of the main house, gone before she can be fully observed. This figure was described by people who had not heard the Chloe story before their stay, by people who encountered her in the early morning and later during their daytime tour, heard the legend for the first time and felt their blood go cold. The Myrtles does not care whether its stories are historically accurate. It keeps showing you the same things regardless. There is also the matter of the children. Multiple guests have reported hearing children laughing in the house at times. When there are no children present, the sound has been described as playful, light, the natural unself, conscious laughter of young kids at play. It comes from empty rooms. It comes from the upstairs hallway in the middle of the night. It echoes through the property during quiet morning hours before other guests are awake. And then there are the children who have been seen. 2 small figures described as young girls, wearing clothing that does not match any contemporary style. They have been seen on the front porch. They have been seen in the garden near the creep myrtle trees. They appear, and then they are gone. Guests have asked staff about the children, assuming they must be the kids of an employee or another guest, and been told quietly that there are no children currently at the property. The children at the Myrtles have their own story attached to them, connected to the Chloe legend. They are said to be the girls who died from the poisoned cake. But as we have established, that specific story lacks historical verification. What exists, regardless of the explanation attached to it, is the consistent reporting of 2 small figures, 2 young presences, by guests across many decades who have never spoken to each other and who describe the same thing. Small hands pressed against a mirror, 2 girls on the porch, laughter from empty rooms. There is a thread connecting all of these things. A thread that research and investigation have never managed to fully cut. The Myrtles Plantation holds its dead. Whatever the mechanism, Whether you call it haunting, or residual energy, or the psychological weight of a place that has absorbed 2 centuries of suffering and violence, the property does not release what it takes, and what it takes, it shows you. Again and again and again. In 1980, James and Frances Myers purchased the Myrtles Plantation with the intention of restoring it and eventually opening it to the public as a historic inn and tour destination. The process of restoration uncovered things that deepened the mystery rather than explaining it. Workers reported tools being moved overnight. They reported hearing sounds, footsteps, voices, the sound of a piano being played. In parts of the house where no one was working and no instruments were present, one worker reportedly refused to return to the property after an experience he would not describe in detail. The Myrtles opened to the public and quickly became one of the most visited paranormal destinations in the United States. It has been featured in countless documentaries, investigated by paranormal research teams, photographed and recorded by thousands of guests every year. The evidence collected there, voices caught on audio recordings, temperature anomalies, photographic anomalies, the consistent eyewitness testimony, has made it one of the most thoroughly documented, allegedly haunted locations in the country. Troy Taylor and David Wishart came to the Myrtles not as believers looking for confirmation, but as investigators looking for truth. They examined the historical record with care and honesty. They separated what could be verified from what could not. They challenged the legends and tested the stories. And what they concluded, after all of that rigorous examination, was something they stated plainly. The number of reported accounts at the Myrtles, the consistency of the experiences described by independent witnesses across generations, would qualify this house as one of the most haunted locations in the entire country. One confirmed murder, dozens of unexplained phenomena, 230 years of the same things being seen, heard, and felt in the same rooms by people who have never met each other and never compared notes. The Myrtles Plantation is still standing, still operating as a hotel and tour destination. You can book a room there tonight, if you wanted to. You can sleep in one of the historic rooms, walk those grounds in the dark, lie awake in the quiet hours of the morning listening to see if you hear footsteps on the stairs. And if you hear them, if you count them, and they stop at 17, you will know exactly who just walked past your door. Story 2. The darkness that surrounds the Myrtles does not begin or end with William Winter. It stretches back further, and it spreads wider, and it touches the lives of people who came to that property long after Winter's blood dried on those 17 steps. Because here is something that doesn't get talked about enough when people discuss the Myrtles. The house has had many owners over its 200+ year history, and the pattern of tragedy that follows the property, the way loss and violence and unexplained events seem to cluster around it like weather around a mountain, is not something that appeared once and faded. It is something that has repeated itself across generations, across families, across completely different sets of people who had no connection to each other, except for the fact that they all lived in the same house. Let's talk about the Sterling family, who owned the Myrtles for a significant portion of the 19th century. Ruffin Gray Sterling acquired the plantation in 1834 and invested heavily in it, expanding the house significantly and bringing it to something close to its current form. He and his wife, Mary Catherine Cobb, built a life at the Myrtles, raised children there, watched their family grow, and the plantation prosper. But prosperity in the antebellum South was built on an ugliness that could not be sustained, and when the Civil War came, it came for families like the Sterlings with particular ferocity. The war years at the Myrtles were grim. The plantation was in the path of Union forces moving through Louisiana, and properties like the Myrtles, large, wealthy, symbol of everything the Confederacy was fighting to preserve, were often occupied, ransacked, or destroyed by Union soldiers. The Sterlings' world was dismantled by the war in ways that left deep marks on the family and on the property. Several members of the family died during this period from illness, from the violence of the war, from the cascading consequences of a society tearing itself apart. And after the war, during Reconstruction, came William Winter. Winter had married Sarah Sterling, daughter of the family, and through that marriage eventually became the manager and then the owner of the property. He was a man of law in a land that was rapidly becoming lawless again in different ways. The white supremacist terror campaigns of Reconstruction era Louisiana were creating new forms of violence, even as the legal institution of slavery was ending. Winter navigated this world as best he could. He was killed in it anyway. His wife, Sarah, outlived him. She continued to live at the Myrtles after his murder, raising their children in the house where their father had died on the stairs. Imagine what that would be like, to wake up every morning and walk past the spot where the person you loved bled out. To put your children to bed knowing that they fell asleep to the same sounds their father heard in his final moments. To live, day after day, in a house that held the memory of a death that was never answered for. Some accounts suggest that Sarah Winter was deeply affected by her husband's murder in ways that went beyond ordinary grief. There are stories, some documented, some passed down through oral tradition, that she became withdrawn, that she communicated very little with the outside world, that she found it difficult to leave the house. Whether this is accurate or embellished, it speaks to something real about the psychological weight of tragedy in a place from which you cannot easily escape. The Myrtles changed hands several more times over the following decades. Each transition brought new families, new stories, new possibilities, and yet the property seemed to leave its mark on everyone who came to it. There are accounts from the early 20th century of families moving into the Myrtles and experiencing things they could not explain. Objects displaced overnight, lights seen in windows when the house was empty, the persistent sense of being observed in rooms where no one else was present. These accounts come from people who had no particular interest in ghost stories, no desire for attention, no motivation to invent experiences. They came as ordinary residents of an ordinary house and left with things they could not account for. By the mid-20th century, the Myrtles had gained enough of a reputation that it was difficult to maintain as a private residence. The weight of its history was becoming part of its identity. And when the decision was eventually made to open it to the public, to lean into that history rather than fight against it, something interesting happened. The documentation became much more systematic. Ghost tours began being offered regularly. Overnight stays became available. And suddenly, there was a mechanism for collecting the experiences of hundreds of different people who came to the Myrtles from all over the country, spent the night, and reported what happened to them. Paranormal investigators began to visit with equipment, audio recorders, thermal cameras, electromagnetic field detectors, devices designed to capture evidence of things outside the normal range of human perception. The consistency of what was found and reported across all of these different visitors and investigators is what makes the Myrtles case so compelling to serious researchers. Multiple independent audio recordings made at the Myrtles have captured sounds that were not present to the naked ear at the time of recording. Voices, movements, sounds that upon playback appear to contain intelligible fragments of words or phrases. These recordings have been analyzed by audio professionals who confirmed that the sounds were not the result of equipment malfunction, interference, or obvious environmental explanation. They are anomalies. Unexplained anomalies that have been captured repeatedly by different people using different equipment in the same locations within the house. Thermal imaging has captured what appears to be heat signatures in shapes consistent with human forms in rooms where no living person was present. These images have been reviewed and found not to be the result of residual heat from recent occupancy, equipment artifact, or other known technical explanation. They are, again, anomalies. The electromagnetic field readings at the Myrtles show consistent irregularities in specific locations within the house. The staircase, the area near the main mirror, the ladies' parlor, EMF spikes in locations where no electrical equipment is present and no known source of electromagnetic interference has been identified. Consistent, repeated, unexplained. Now, to be fair, none of this constitutes scientific proof of anything supernatural. Paranormal investigation is not a science in the formal sense, and the equipment used in these investigations is designed to detect physical anomalies rather than confirm metaphysical claims. An unexplained EMF spike does not prove a ghost. An anomalous voice on a recording does not prove the presence of a spirit. Thermal imaging artifacts do not prove that the dead walk in that house, but they do prove that something unusual is happening at the Myrtles, something that instruments detect, something that repeats, something that is not random noise, but appears to have pattern and location and consistency. And that is before you even get to the human testimony. One of the most striking categories of testimony from the Myrtles comes from people who are inherently skeptical. People who came to the property precisely because they did not believe in ghosts and who left with experiences they could not explain. These are not the accounts of credulous tourists hoping for a supernatural experience and finding it because they wanted to. These are the accounts of people who actively resisted the idea of something unusual happening to them. A researcher who came to study the Myrtles from a debunking perspective someone who had spent years applying rational explanation to alleged haunted locations, reported spending a night in the main house and experiencing stated she could not against, that she publicly snorted she could not account for. She woke at approximately 3 in the morning to hear footsteps clearly ascending the staircase. Knowing the story, she remained still and counted the steps. She counted 17 before the sound stopped. She got up, checked the staircase, found it empty, went back to bed. She lay awake for the rest of the night. In her published account of the investigation, she did not claim supernatural explanation, but she did state that the sound she heard was unambiguous, clearly the sound of footsteps on wooden stairs, and that her search of the staircase and surrounding area found no source for it. She also noted that the temperature in her room dropped measurably between approximately 2:30 and 4 in the morning, returning to normal around dawn. She had monitoring equipment running throughout the night. The temperature change was real, documented, and unexplained by any environmental factor she could identify. These are the kinds of accounts that make serious researchers pause. Not the ghost tour dramatizations, not the obviously embellished legends, the careful, reluctant, methodologically rigorous accounts of people who came to debunk and left unable to do so. There is something at the Myrtles that does not want to be explained away, and that something has made its presence felt not just inside the house, but on the grounds surrounding it. The Myrtles Plantation sits on property that includes its original outbuildings, gardens, and the land that once formed the working body of a plantation operation. The grounds are shaded by massive live oak trees draped in Spanish moss, the iconic imagery of the Louisiana landscape that is beautiful in daylight and deeply unsettling after dark. The creep myrtle trees that gave the plantation its name still grow on the property. The carriage house still stands. The smokehouse still stands. The physical remnants of the plantation's working history remain scattered across the grounds, quiet and weathered and present. And it is on these grounds, not just inside the house, that things have been seen. A figure has been reported near the carriage house. A male figure, described as tall and dark, clothed, standing very still in the shadows near the outbuilding. Witnesses who saw this figure first assumed it was another guest or an employee. When they looked more directly, the figure was gone. There was no sound of movement, no footsteps on the gravel path, no door opening or closing, just a presence, and then the absence of that presence. Near the old smokehouse, multiple visitors have reported an oppressive feeling, a heaviness that is difficult to describe, but that several people independently characterize as grief, not fear exactly, grief the specific. Chest, heavy weight of sorrow, so deep it has left a permanent impression on a physical space. People who have no particular sensitivity to paranormal phenomena have stopped near the smokehouse and found themselves unexpectedly overwhelmed by an emotion that did not belong to them, that came from somewhere else, from something soaked into the air and the earth in that specific spot. What happened near that smokehouse? What took place in that ordinary outbuilding over the decades and centuries it stood on plantation grounds? The records do not say. The records from this era are notoriously incomplete when it comes to the lives of enslaved people who were considered property rather than persons, and whose experiences were not considered worth preserving. Whatever happened, there is lost from the written record. But it has apparently not been lost from the place itself. This is perhaps the most honest and the most haunting thing that can be said about the Myrtles, that whatever haunts it is not just the dramatic, documented, named events, the murder of William Winter, the legend of Chloe, the stories that have been told on ghost tours. What haunts it is everything, the documented and the undocumented, the famous dead and the nameless dead, the people whose stories were recorded and the people whose stories were not, the violence that made headlines and the violence that nobody wrote down. The Myrtles Plantation was, for a significant portion of its existence, a slave plantation. Dozens of people were owned and forced to work there under conditions of comprehensive brutality. Their births were not celebrated. Their deaths were noted only as the loss of a financial asset. Their suffering was invisible to the society that perpetuated it. They lived and died on that land in a form of erasure so total that most of their names are simply gone. And yet, they are not gone from the Myrtles. The grief near the smokehouse, the small handprints on the mirror, the children's laughter from empty rooms, the figure of a woman in old clothing moving through the main house in the early morning. These are not stories invented by a ghost tour operator looking to make money from the macabre. They are reported by people who came to that land without knowing what happened there and felt, with their own senses, the residue of something that refused to be erased. The Myrtles holds its history in a way that history books cannot. It holds it in the wood of the stairs and the glass of the mirror and the air of the grounds and the shadows near the outbuildings. It holds it the way very old places sometimes hold their wounds, not as stored information that can be retrieved and examined, but as a living presence that still moves, still breathes, still presses its hands against the glass from the other side. In 1987, a woman named Hester Eby was staying at the Myrtles as a guest. She was a retired schoolteacher from Alabama, staying alone on a road trip she had planned for years. She had heard the Myrtles was a beautiful historic property with good food and a fascinating history. She had not done significant research into its paranormal reputation before arriving. She booked a room in the main house and arrived on a quiet Tuesday in October when the property was not busy and she essentially had the place largely to herself. She would later describe her experience in a letter to her daughter, which was eventually shared with researchers studying the Myrtles. She wrote that on her first night, she woke at some point after midnight to find that the room felt different. Not cold exactly, the temperature was fine, but the air had a quality she struggled to describe. She wrote that it felt occupied, that the room felt as though it contained more than just herself. She sat up and looked around and saw nothing in the darkness, but the feeling persisted, the sense that something was in the room with her, standing very still near the window, not threatening, not aggressive, just present, just there. She lay back down and, to her own surprise, fell asleep. In the morning she mentioned to one of the staff members that she had woken in the night feeling that something was in her room. The staff member, a woman who had worked at the Myrtles for many years, asked her to describe the feeling more specifically. Hester described it. The feeling of occupancy, the sense of a presence near the window, the stillness of it. The staff member nodded slowly. She said that several guests had described similar experiences in that particular room. That the presence near the window was one of the most consistently reported phenomena in the entire house. She did not elaborate on who or what it might be. She did not need to. Hester Eby finished her stay at the Myrtles. She ate her breakfast, took her tour, drove away on a bright October morning into the Louisiana countryside. But she wrote in her letter to her daughter that she had left something behind at the Myrtles. Something she could not name. As if the house had taken a piece of her attention and was not going to give it back. She wrote that she found herself thinking about it at odd moments. While cooking dinner, while watching television, while lying in bed in her quiet house in Alabama. The sensation of that occupied room. She wrote, "I don't know what is in that house, but something is, and whatever it is, it knows you're there. Whatever it is, it knows you're there." That is the Myrtles. That is the heart of it. Not the ghost tour legend. Not the dramatized version of William Winter staggering up 17 stairs. Not the story of Chloe with its historical problems and emotional power. The heart of it is simpler and more unsettling than any of those narratives. It is a place that sees you, a place that has been accumulating presences for over 200 years. The dead, the grieved, the violently ended, the erased, the unnamed. And that does something with all of that accumulation that no one has managed to fully explain or measure or document away. You can book a room there. You can sleep in a bed in one of those historic rooms, surrounded by walls that have absorbed 2 centuries of human experience. You can wake in the night to the darkness and the quiet of the Louisiana countryside and lie very still, listening. And if something in the room feels occupied, if the air feels like it contains more than just yourself, you will know exactly what Hester Eby meant. You will know that whatever is in that house knows you're there. Story 3. So here we are. You've heard about William Winter and his 17 steps. You've heard about the mirror and the handprints that keep coming back. You've heard about the grief near the smokehouse and the children on the porch and the woman in the green turban moving through the rooms of the main house before dawn. And maybe some part of you is thinking, okay, old house, lots of history, people's imaginations running wild in a dark and atmospheric place. I can explain this. I want to spend some time with that thought because I think it deserves honest examination. The rational explanations for what happens at the Myrtles are not unreasonable on their surface. Old houses make sounds. Wood expands and contracts with temperature changes. Plumbing creates noises that can be mistaken for footsteps. The power of suggestion is real and measurable. If you know you're sleeping in a place with a ghost story attached to it, your brain is primed to interpret ambiguous sensory input as evidence of that ghost story. Hypnagogic hallucinations, which occur in the transitional state between sleep and waking, are extremely common and frequently involve the sense of a presence in the room. The smell of something burning, sounds that don't belong, a figure at the foot of the bed. These are all documented features of hypnagogic experience that require no supernatural explanation. The mirror handprints have rational possibilities too. Human hands naturally press against reflective surfaces. Oils from skin remain on glass long after the visible mark seems to fade, and can reappear under certain humidity or temperature conditions. Children who touch a mirror may leave impressions that are temporarily invisible after cleaning and reappear as conditions change. The feelings of grief near the smokehouse. Infrasound, low frequency sound below the range of human hearing, is known to produce feelings of unease, dread, and inexplicable sadness in people exposed to it. Old buildings are frequently sources of infrasound from structural vibration or air movement through cavities and spaces. A person standing near the smokehouse might be experiencing a completely physical, completely explainable acoustic phenomenon that their brain interprets as emotional rather than sensory. These explanations are available. They are not unreasonable. But here is the thing that the rational framework struggles with, and that I think deserves to be sat with honestly. The explanations only work if you consider each experience in isolation. The hypnagogic hallucination explanation works if one person, on one night, wakes to the sense of a presence in a room. But when 50 different people, over 50 different years, staying in the same room, report the same specific sensation, a presence near the window, standing still, not threatening, that explanation starts to stretch. Because hypnagogic hallucinations are highly individualized. They draw from your own anxieties, your own subconscious imagery, your own personal psychological landscape. They are not consistent across unrelated individuals in the same location. The power of suggestion explanation works if the people experiencing things at the Myrtles have been primed by prior knowledge of the ghost stories. But many of the most compelling accounts, including Hester Eby's letter, including the testimonies of researchers who came to debunk, come from people who specifically did not have detailed prior knowledge of the Myrtles' specific stories. They knew it had a reputation, but they did not know the details. And yet they reported the same things, in the same locations, as everyone else. The infrasound explanation for the emotional heaviness near the smokehouse is plausible. But it does not explain why the specific emotion reported is grief rather than the wide range of other emotional responses that infrasound produces in different people, in different locations. Grief is specific, it is consistent. People who have no connection to the history of the plantation arrive at that smokehouse and feel grief. That consistency is difficult to account for with a purely physical explanation. And the mirror, the consistent reappearance of small handprints on a mirror that has been replaced, that one genuinely defies the rational framework when you examine it closely. Because the skin oil explanation requires that children have touched the new mirror in the same pattern, in the same positions as they touched the old one, which requires either an extraordinary coincidence or a deliberate act. And the deliberate act explanation means someone is regularly pressing child-sized hands against the Myrtles mirror as a prank, which requires the active, sustained involvement of staff or regular visitors in a deception that has been maintained for many years without anyone coming forward to take credit for it or expose it. None of these explanations are impossible, but when you stack them up, when you apply a rational explanation to every individual experience and then look at the full picture of what that requires, you end up with something that strains credibility in its own right. A house where, by coincidence, infrasound produces location-specific grief, and children regularly happen to press their hands in the same positions on replacement mirrors, and dozens of unrelated guests all happen to have hypnagogic hallucinations of the same presence in the same room, and everyone who hears footsteps on the stairs happens to count to exactly 17 before they stop. At some point, the rational explanations accumulate as much of a credibility problem as the supernatural ones. Troy Taylor and David Wishart understood this. That is why, after their rigorous investigation, after they stripped away everything that could not be verified, after they challenged every legend and tested every story, they still said what they said, that the accounts collected at the Myrtles are significant, that the consistency and volume of independent testimony qualifies this as one of the most genuinely documented, allegedly haunted locations in the country. They did not say ghosts. They were careful researchers. They did not make claims they could not support, but they also did not walk away from the Myrtles saying everything is explained. Because it isn't. What we are left with, when we are honest about it, is a place that has accumulated more than 2 centuries of human experience. Joy and suffering, love and violence, birth and death, the named and the unnamed. And that does something with all of that accumulation that we do not currently have a framework to fully understand. Maybe that framework will come someday. Maybe the physics of how places absorb and retain the energy of the events that occur within them will eventually be understood and measured and documented in a way that bridges the gap between what we call paranormal and what we call natural. Maybe what happens at the Myrtles will turn out to be explainable in ways we cannot currently explain. The way electromagnetic radiation was unexplainable before we had the tools to detect and measure it. Or maybe it is what it looks like. Maybe the dead do not always leave when they die. Maybe a place that has held as much suffering as the Myrtles Plantation, the systematic brutality of slavery, the wartime violence, the murder on the stairs, the grief of the families who lived there and lost things they could not get back. Maybe a place like that develops something, a weight, a presence, a refusal to let the past become the past. Maybe William Winter is still climbing those stairs because he never finished what he started, because he was climbing toward his wife, toward the woman he loved, and someone took that from him before he could reach her. And whatever part of a person persists after death, whatever fragment of will or memory or love remains when the body stops, his is still on that staircase, still counting steps, still trying to get to her. Maybe the children pressing their hands against the mirror are still trying to communicate something, still trying to be seen by the living who move through that house, who clean that mirror, who look into it and see only their own reflection. And maybe they press those small hands against the glass because they can see through it to the other side, and they want someone on the other side to press back. Maybe the grief near the smokehouse is not infrasound. Maybe it is the accumulated sorrow of people who suffered there and were never acknowledged, never mourned publicly, never given the ceremonies and rituals that the living use to help the dead cross over. Maybe that grief is still there because it was never released, because there was no one to release it. These are not scientific claims. I am not telling you that ghosts are real in the way that tables and chairs are real. I am telling you that the Myrtles Plantation exists, that it sits on a piece of land in Francisville, Louisiana, that has been inhabited and shaped and scarred by human beings for over 2 centuries, that a man named William Winter was killed there and never received justice, that people who were enslaved there lived and died without their stories being preserved, that in that house, in those rooms, in that ground, there are things that instruments detect and witnesses report, and rational explanation struggles to account for. And that, if you want to know whether any of it is real, you can go there. Tonight, if you wanted to, you can book a room. You can lie in one of those historic beds, in one of those historic rooms, and close your eyes in the Louisiana dark, and you can count the footsteps on the stairs and see if they stop at 17. The Myrtles Plantation is not just a ghost story. It is an American story. It is the story of what this country built and what it cost and what it left behind. The beauty of those covered porches and the iron lacework and the crepe myrtle trees in bloom. And underneath all of that beauty, the foundation that beauty was built on, the suffering that paid for it, the lives that were taken to make it possible. Haunted houses do not come from nowhere. They come from history. They come from the things that happened in them and the people those things happened to. And the Myrtles Plantation, with all of its complexity and darkness and unresolved questions, is a place where history refuses to stay in the past, where the mirror keeps showing you who has been here before, where the stairs remember the man who died on them, where small hands press against the glass in the dark, and something that knows you're there watches from the shadows near the window, and the footsteps count themselves out on the wood above your head one by one, until they reach 17 and stop. And the silence after that 17th step is the loudest thing you will ever hear. So, we've been through it all together tonight. William Winter on those stairs, the mirror that will not stay clean, the grief that lives near the smokehouse, the children that guests see on the porch and then can't find anywhere, the woman in the green turban, the presence near the window that stands very still and knows you're there. I want to know what got to you. Which one of these, which story, which detail, which moment is the one that you're going to be thinking about when you turn off your lights tonight? Drop it in the comments right now. Tell me which story disturbed you the most. And if you think I'm going to be able to sleep tonight after researching all of this. Mubarak is absolutely not okay. I will tell you that for free. Seriously though, if you made it this far, you already know this is the kind of content that hits different than what's out there. No filler, no padding, just the real stories, told the way they deserve to be told. If you've got a friend who likes this kind of thing, the true history, the real accounts, the places that don't let go of their dead, share this video with them right now. Don't even text them first. Just send it. Let it be their problem too. This is Mubarak. This is Lunar Law, and we'll see you in the dark.